The gunshot echoed across Sweetwater Creek, silencing the evening chatter of birds and making 19-year-old Grace Miller freeze in her tracks. She'd been running for 2 days straight, her dress torn at the hem and her once white apron now stained with dust and dried blood that wasn't her own. The year was 1876, and in this corner of Wyoming Territory, the law was whatever a man with money said it was. "There she is," a gruff voice called out, sending Grace's heart hammering against her ribs. She plunged deeper into the woods, brambles tearing at her arms as she pushed forward. The creek gurgled ahead, offering her only chance of throwing off the hunting dogs. Grace splashed into the cold water, gasping at the shock but forcing herself to move downstream. "You're only making it worse for yourself, girl," another voice shouted. "Mr. Hargrove says you're his property fair and square. He's got papers." Grace bit back a sob. 3 weeks ago, she'd been working as a maid in a Denver hotel when Stanford Hargrove, a wealthy mine owner, had arrived. He'd taken an interest in her immediately, offering her father money for her hand in marriage. When her father refused, Hargrove had produced documents claiming her father owed him a substantial debt, a debt Grace had never heard mentioned before. The next day, her father was found dead in an alley, and Hargrove arrived at her door with a sheriff and papers claiming he now owned her as payment. The creek grew deeper, the current stronger. Grace's sodden skirts weighed her down, but she pressed on, following the water's path as twilight faded to darkness. Behind her, the voices grew fainter, but she knew they wouldn't give up. Hargrove's men never did. After what felt like hours, she stumbled onto a rocky shore, shivering violently. In the distance, through the trees, a warm light flickered. A cabin. Grace hesitated it could be a trap or worse, people who would turn her in for a reward. But the alternative was freezing to death in the woods. She approached cautiously, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The small cabin was well kept, with a small corral where 2 horses dozed standing. A dog barked once, alerting the occupant. The door swung open, revealing a tall silhouette holding a lantern. "Who's out there?" a deep voice called. Grace stepped forward, her hands raised. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need help." The lantern lifted higher, illuminating her face. The man in the doorway was younger than she expected, perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair and eyes that narrowed as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "You're half drowned," he observed, stepping back. "Come in before you catch your death." Grace hesitated, glancing behind her into the darkness. "Whoever you're running from," the man said quietly, "they won't find you here tonight." She had no choice but to trust him. Grace stepped into the warmth of the cabin, her body shaking so badly her teeth chattered. The interior was simple but comfortable, a stone fireplace with a cooking pot suspended above the flames, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner. "Name's Yates Nichols," the man said, closing the door firmly and sliding a bolt into place. "Most folks call me Nick." He moved to a trunk, pulling out a woolen blanket. "You got a name, Grace," she said, accepting the blanket gratefully. "Grace Miller." Nick nodded, turning to stir something in the pot. "Whatever trouble you're in, you don't have to tell me tonight. Get yourself dry by the fire. There's stew if you're hungry." Grace sank onto a stool by the hearth, the warmth of the flames seeping into her frozen limbs. "Thank you," she whispered. Nick watched her from the corner of his eye as he ladled stew into a wooden bowl. She was clearly terrified, but there was something defiant in the set of her jaw. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to recognize someone running for their life. "Here," he said, handing her the bowl and a spoon. "Eat slow. Been a while since you've had food, I reckon," Grace nodded, taking a careful sip of the broth. 2 days. Nick sat across from her, giving her space. "My sister's about your size, left some clothes when she visited last month. You can borrow them till yours dry. Your sister." Grace asked cautiously. "Lives in Cheyenne now. Married a blacksmith." Nick's expression softened slightly. "Good man, treats her right." Grace ate slowly, feeling strength return to her limbs. She hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, especially a man living alone in the wilderness. "I can sleep in the stable," she said finally, setting down the empty bowl. Nick shook his head. "You'll take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. Been doing it for years when I'm out on the range." Grace wanted to protest but was too exhausted. Nick showed her where his sister's clothes were stored, then stepped outside to give her privacy. She changed quickly into the simple cotton dress, laying her wet clothes by the fire to dry. When Nick returned, he had a bedroll under his arm. "Get some rest," he said simply. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Grace curled up on the narrow bed, expecting to lie awake with fear, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. She woke to sunlight streaming through a small window and the smell of coffee. Nick was already up, frying salt pork in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced over as she stirred. "Morning," he said. "Figured you needed the sleep." Grace sat up, pushing her tangled hair from her face. "What time is it?" "Past 9. Nick flipped the meat in the pan. "No rush, nobody comes out this way much." As they ate breakfast, Grace felt Nick watching her, waiting. Finally, she set down her coffee cup and met his gaze. "I'm running from a man named Stanford Hargrove," she said quietly. "He claims he owns me." Nick's expression darkened. "Owns you?" Grace explained everything: her father's supposed debt, his mysterious death, Hargrove's arrival with legal papers, and the corrupt sheriff. "He said I'm his property now," Grace finished, her voice bitter. "To do with as he pleases. I ran the first chance I got. That was 2 days ago. His men have been hunting me since." Nick's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "No man owns another, not anymore." "The sheriff seemed to think differently," Grace said. "Hargrove has connections, money, papers that look legal enough." Nick was quiet for a long moment. "I know Hargrove. Man owns half the mining operations between here and Denver, mean as a rattler and twice as poisonous." He set down his cup. "What will you do now?" Grace's shoulders slumped. "I don't know, keep running, I suppose." "Running's no life for anyone," Nick said, "especially not alone." Before Grace could respond, Nick's dog began barking outside. Nick moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Riders," he said, his voice tight. "3 of them." Grace's heart leapt into her throat. "Hargrove's men." Nick grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace. "Back door leads to the stable. If things go south, take my buckskin and ride west. Follow the creek, then head north when you hit the big pine stand. There's a town called Riverview about 20 miles on. Sheriff, there's an honest man." "I can't take your horse. You can and you will if need be," Nick cut her off. "Now get back in that bedroom and stay quiet." Grace hurried to the small bedroom, leaving the door cracked so she could hear. Nick stepped onto his porch as the riders approached. "Morning, gentlemen," Nick called, his rifle held casually but visibly. "Something I can help you with," the lead rider, a burly man with a red beard, reined in his horse. "Looking for a runaway girl, young, dark hair, might have come this way." "Haven't seen anybody," Nick said easily. "Been here alone since Tuesday." Redbeard studied Nick's face. "Mind if we have a look around? Mr. Hargrove's offering $100 reward." "I mind considerably," Nick replied, his voice hardening. "This is my property and you've got no warrant I can see." The second rider, a lean man with a pockmarked face, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We ain't asking nice forever, cowboy. That girl's stolen property." Nick's expression didn't change, but his finger moved closer to the trigger. No such thing as stolen property when it's a human being. "Now I've been polite so far, but my patience is wearing thin. Turn around and ride out." The third man, who had remained silent, suddenly pointed toward the cabin. "Those look like woman's clothes drying inside that window." Grace's heart stopped, her dress hanging by the fire. Redbeard grinned unpleasantly. "Thought you said you were alone." "My sister visited," Nick said smoothly. "Left this morning." "You're lying," pockmarked face said, reaching for his holster. What happened next was so fast Grace barely registered it. Nick fired a warning shot into the air, then leveled his rifle at Redbeard's chest. "Next one won't miss," he said calmly. "Now I'm going to say this one more time. There's no girl here and you're trespassing. Leave." The 3 men exchanged glances. Redbeard nodded reluctantly. "We'll go." "But Hargrove won't be pleased." "Hargrove's pleasure isn't my concern," Nick replied. The men turned their horses, Redbeard casting one last suspicious look at the cabin before they rode away. Nick remained on the porch until they disappeared from sight, then came back inside, his face grim. "They'll be back," he said, setting his rifle down. "Probably with more men." Grace emerged from the bedroom, trembling. "I should go. I've put you in enough danger." "And go where?" Nick demanded. "They're watching the trails now. You wouldn't make it 5 miles." I can't stay here, Grace insisted. Hargrove won't stop. He thinks he owns me. Nick's jaw tightened. Then I'll burn the paper that says so. Grace stared at him, not comprehending. What? Those papers he has, Nick said. The ones saying he owns you will destroy them. That's impossible, Grace whispered. They're in his safe, in his house, in Denver. Nick crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a map, spreading it on the table. Denver's 4 days hard ride. We could be there in 5 if we're careful. We, Grace echoed. Nick looked up at her, his eyes determined. I'm not letting you face this alone. Why? Grace asked, genuinely confused by this stranger's willingness to help her. You don't even know me. Nick was quiet for a moment. 2 years ago, my younger sister nearly ended up in a similar situation. If not for good people who helped her. He shook his head. Some things a decent man can't ignore. Grace studied his face, searching for deceit but finding none. They'll kill you, they've killed for less. They can try, Nick said simply. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe while I make preparations. By midday, they had a plan. Nick had a friend, an old trapper named Joseph, who lived in a hidden valley 3 hours' ride away. Grace would stay with him while Nick gathered supplies and information. If all went well, they would leave for Denver within 2 days. As they rode through the forest, Nick leading the way on his gray stallion while Grace followed on the buckskin, they talked. Nick had been a ranch hand, then a trail guide before saving enough to buy his own small spread. He ran a modest herd of cattle on land leased from the government, did some hunting and trapping in winter, and occasionally worked as a scout for the army when money was tight. What about you? He asked Grace. Before all this happened? I was a maid at the Grand Hotel in Denver, she replied. Before that, I lived with my father. He was a carpenter until he hurt his back. Then he drank too much and I had to find work. She sighed. I never knew my mother. She died when I was small. Nick nodded thoughtfully. My parents died in a flash flood when I was 16. Raised my sister best I could. You did well, it sounds like, Grace said. A small smile touched Nick's lips. She'd argue that point, but she turned out all right. Joseph's cabin was so well hidden that Grace would have ridden past it if Nick hadn't pointed it out. The old trapper emerged from the trees like a ghost, rifle in hand, relaxing only when he recognized Nick. Bringing trouble to my door, Nichols? Joseph asked, eyeing Grace. Hoping to keep it from yours, Nick corrected. Need a favor, Joseph. Inside the cabin, over cups of bitter coffee, Nick explained the situation. Joseph listened without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When Nick finished, the old man studied Grace for a long moment. Girl, he said finally, is this Cowboy's plan what you want? Grace met his gaze steadily. I want to be free. If destroying Hargrove's false claim on me will do that, yes. Joseph nodded once. Then you can stay. My Eliza's been gone 15 years, but her clothes are still in that trunk. Help yourself. Nick left at dawn the next day, promising to return within 48 hours. Grace watched him ride away, an unexpected ache in her chest. Joseph noticed but said nothing, merely handing her a wooden bucket. Creeks that way, he said. Fish won't catch themselves. The 2 days with Joseph were surprisingly peaceful. The old man taught Grace how to set traps, clean fish, and shoot his old revolver. Never know when you might need it, he said gruffly. They spoke little, but Grace found comfort in his quiet presence. On the evening of the second day, as they sat by the fire, Joseph finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. What will you do after, if this works? Grace stared into the flames. I don't know, I can't go back to Denver, Joseph nodded. World's a big place. Bigger than most realize. Is it? Grace asked softly. Sometimes it feels very small and dangerous. It's both, Joseph admitted, but there's good in it too. When Nick returned the following morning, Grace felt a rush of relief so strong it surprised her. He looked tired but satisfied, a canvas sack slung over his saddle. Got what we need, he told them, unpacking supplies. Food, ammunition, and information. Hargrove's in Denver now. Plans to return to his country estate in 3 days. That's our window. Joseph handed Nick a cup of coffee. You'll need rest before you go. Nick nodded gratefully, accepting the cup. His eyes met Grace's briefly, something unspoken passing between them. How have you been? He asked. Learning to shoot, Grace replied with a small smile. She's not half bad, Joseph confirmed. Quick learner. They departed at first light the next day, Joseph pressing a small revolver into Grace's hands before they left. "Keep it hidden," he advised. "Use it if you must." The journey to Denver was tense, Nick choosing isolated trails and avoiding main roads. They camped in hidden spots, speaking little but growing more comfortable in each other's presence. On the third night, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Grace finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "What if we fail?" Nick looked up from cleaning his rifle. "We won't." "But if we do," Grace persisted. "If something happens to you because of me, nothing's going to happen," Nick interrupted. Grace stood up, frustrated. "You can't know that. Hargrove is powerful. He has men everywhere." I know exactly who he is," Nick said quietly, setting down his rifle. "Better than you might think." Something in his tone made Grace pause. "What do you mean?" Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My father worked Hargrove's mines when I was a boy, died in a cave-in. That wouldn't have happened if Hargrove had spent the money on proper supports. 12 men died that day. Hargrove called it an act of God and gave the widows $20 each." Grace sat back down, understanding dawning. "That's why you're helping me. It's about revenge." "No," Nick said firmly. "It's about doing what's right. Revenge won't bring my father back. But stopping Hargrove from ruining your life, that's something I can do." Grace studied his face in the firelight. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Nick replied, his eyes meeting hers. "You're brave, determined. You deserve a chance at freedom." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility neither was ready to name. Grace looked away first, her cheeks warm despite the cool night air. "We should get some rest," she said softly. "Long day tomorrow." They reached Denver on the fourth day, the city sprawling before them in the valley. Nick had a plan. Hargrove would be attending a banquet that evening, a fundraiser for the governor's re-election campaign. His house would be less guarded than usual. "My friend Thomas works in Hargrove's stables," Nick explained as they waited in a small boarding house room he'd rented. "He says the safe is in Hargrove's study, second floor east side of the house." "And how do we get in?" Grace asked. Nick smiled slightly. "Service entrance. Thomas will let us in during dinner when most of the staff is busy with the banquet preparations." Grace twisted her hands nervously. "And if we're caught, we run," Nick said simply. "I've got horses waiting." Darkness fell, and they made their way through back alleys to Hargrove's mansion. Grace wore a servant's dress borrowed from Thomas's wife, while Nick had dressed as a deliveryman. Thomas was waiting at the service entrance, his face tense. "You're insane," he whispered to Nick as he let them in. "If you're caught, we won't be," Nick assured him. "Just keep watch." The house was quiet, most servants occupied with preparations for Hargrove's return from the banquet. Nick and Grace moved silently through the kitchen and up the narrow servants' stairs. The second floor was deserted, the hallway dimly lit by gas lamps. "This way," Grace whispered, recognizing the corridor from her one visit to Hargrove's mansion with her father. The study door was locked, but Nick produced a set of picks from his pocket. "Another skill from my misspent youth," he murmured, working on the lock until it clicked open. Inside, the study was exactly as Grace remembered: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive desk. Behind the desk hung a painting of a hunting scene. "The safe is behind that," Grace whispered, pointing to the painting. Nick moved it aside, revealing a small iron safe set into the wall. "This might take a while," he warned. Kneeling to examine the lock, Grace stood by the door, listening intently for any sound of approach. Minutes ticked by as Nick worked on the safe, his face a mask of concentration. "Got it," he finally whispered as the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, jewelry, and cash. Nick rifled through the papers quickly, pulling out several that bore Grace's name. "These must be them," he said, scanning them quickly. "Falsified debt documents, a bill of sale." His face darkened with anger. "This is criminal." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Grace froze, her heart pounding. "Someone's coming," she hissed. Nick quickly pocketed the documents, closed the safe, and replaced the painting. They had barely ducked behind a large bookcase when the door opened. Stanford Hargrove himself entered, followed by another man Grace didn't recognize. "The investment is sound," Hargrove was saying. "With the railroad coming through, those land values will triple." "Perhaps," the other man replied skeptically, But the price you're asking is fair considering what's coming, Hargrove cut him off. Now, I have the maps here somewhere. He moved to his desk, rummaging through a drawer. Grace barely breathed, pressed against Nick in the narrow space behind the bookcase. His arm was around her protectively, his body tense and ready to move. Here we are, Hargrove said triumphantly, pulling out a rolled document. Now, as you can see, a commotion downstairs interrupted him. Raised voices, then Thomas calling out, "Fire! Fire in the kitchen!" Hargrove cursed. "Incompetent fools," he muttered. "Wait here, Charles, I'll see what's happening." The moment Hargrove left, Nick moved. "Now," he whispered, pulling Grace toward the door. The other man, Charles, looked up in shock as they emerged from hiding. "What the devil?" Nick didn't hesitate. He struck Charles hard, catching him as he fell and lowering him quietly to the floor. "Sorry about that," he murmured, then grabbed Grace's hand. "Let's go." They slipped into the hallway, hearing the chaos below as servants rushed to deal with what was presumably a diversionary fire set by Thomas. Instead of heading toward the stairs, Nick led Grace to a window at the end of the hall. "Service ladder," he explained, pushing it open. Thomas mentioned it. They climbed down quickly, dropping into the alley behind the house. Shouts echoed from inside as they ran to where their horses waited, tied in a small stable yard 2 blocks away. "Ride," Nick urged, helping Grace mount before swinging onto his own horse. "Don't stop until we reach the meeting point." They galloped through the darkened streets of Denver, avoiding the main thoroughfares and keeping to the shadows. Behind them, they could hear whistles blowing the police had been alerted. After an hour of hard riding, they reached the abandoned mining cabin where they'd arranged to meet Thomas. He was already there, looking nervous but relieved to see them. "It worked?" he asked. Nick nodded, pulling out the documents. "Got them all, I think." Thomas handed them a bundle. "Food, water, and a map to a place you can lie low. Old mining camp, abandoned years ago but still standing." Nick clasped Thomas's shoulder gratefully. "You're a good man, be careful going back." "I will," Thomas promised. "The fire was just smoke, no damage done." "They'll suspect something, but they won't connect it to me." After Thomas left, Nick spread the documents on a rickety table, examining them in the light of a single candle. "Debt certificates, false testimony about your father gambling away your future," Nick growled. "And this." He held up a document that made his face darken with rage. "A bill of sale, for you like you were a horse or cattle." Grace stared at the papers, a lifetime of servitude spelled out in neat legal terms. "Can we destroy them? Will it be enough?" "Not just yet," Nick said thoughtfully. "These prove his crimes, forgery, possibly murder if we can connect him to your father's death." He looked up at her. "This could end him, Grace. Or he could use his influence to bury it all," Grace said bitterly. "Men like Hargrove don't answer to the same laws as the rest of us." Nick carefully folded the documents. "Maybe not, but I know someone who might help. Judge Carruthers in Cheyenne, honest man, my sister's father-in-law." "Cheyenne's days away," Grace protested. "Hargrove will have men searching everywhere." "Which is why we're going to the old mining camp first," Nick explained. "Lie low for a week or so. Let things cool down." The abandoned mining camp was a day's ride into the mountains, a cluster of ramshackle cabins nearly reclaimed by nature. They chose the sturdiest structure, reinforcing the roof and clearing away years of dust and debris. Days passed in an odd domestic rhythm. They hunted, fished, and foraged together. Nick taught Grace more about survival in the wilderness, while she surprised him with her knowledge of edible plants and basic medicine. On the 5th night, as they sat by the fire, Nick finally asked the question that had been between them since the beginning. "What will you do when this is over?" "When you're truly free," Grace stared into the flames, considering. "I don't know, I can't go back to Denver, maybe San Francisco. I've heard there are opportunities for women there." "San Francisco's a long way," Nick observed quietly. "Yes," Grace agreed, looking up at him. "But what choice do I have?" Nick hesitated, then spoke carefully. "You could come back with me to my ranch. It's small, but there's room to grow." Grace's heart quickened. "As what, your housekeeper?" "No," Nick said, meeting her gaze steadily. "As whatever you want to be." The air between them seemed to still. "Nick," Grace whispered, "you barely know me. I know what matters, he replied, moving to sit beside her. I know you're brave and strong. I know you laugh at my terrible jokes. I know you hum when you think no one's listening. His hand found hers. I know I've never met anyone like you. Grace looked down at their joined hands. I'm afraid, she admitted. Of what? Of believing in something good again, of trusting someone. She met his eyes. Of losing you when Hargrove finds us. He won't find us, Nick promised. And even if he did, I'm not easy to lose. Grace couldn't help smiling. Is that so? Stubborn as a mule, my sister always says, Nick replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Especially about things that matter. In that moment, with firelight playing across his face, Grace made a decision. She leaned forward, pressing her lips gently to his. Nick's hand came up to cradle her face, deepening the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Nick rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since I found you by the creek, he confessed. Grace smiled. I wouldn't have let you then. And now, he asked, his voice hopeful. Now, Grace whispered, I might be persuaded. Their idyll couldn't last forever. After a week at the mining camp, they set out for Cheyenne, traveling cautiously and avoiding settlements. The journey took 4 days, and by the time they reached the growing city, they had developed a plan. Judge Carruthers was indeed as honorable as Nick had claimed. After examining the documents and hearing their story, his face grew grave. These are serious crimes, he said, setting the papers down. Forgery, fraud, false imprisonment, possibly murder, but Hargrove is powerful with friends in the territorial government. So there's nothing you can do. Grace asked, her hope faltering. I didn't say that, the judge replied, steepling his fingers. I said it would be difficult, but not impossible. The judge's plan was both simple and audacious. He would summon Hargrove to Cheyenne on the pretext of a business opportunity too lucrative to ignore. When Hargrove arrived, he would find himself facing not only charges based on the documents, but testimony from others who had suffered at his hands. It will take time to gather witnesses, the judge warned. You'll need to stay hidden until then. Nick's sister, Martha, and her husband, William, offered their home, a comfortable house behind their blacksmith shop. Martha welcomed Grace warmly, clearly approving of her brother's obvious affection for the young woman. He's never brought a girl home before, Martha confided as they prepared dinner one evening. Not once in all these years, Grace blushed. We haven't, that is, we're not. Martha laughed. Oh, I know my brother. He's moving at the pace of a careful man, but I see how he looks at you. She squeezed Grace's hand. And how you look at him. Days turned into weeks as Judge Carruthers built his case. Nick and Grace settled into a routine, helping at the blacksmith shop and growing closer each day. Their kisses grew more passionate, their conversations deeper. Nick spoke of his dreams for his ranch, expanding the herd, building a larger house. Grace found herself envisioning that future with her in it. 1 month after their arrival in Cheyenne, Judge Carruthers summoned them to his chambers. Hargrove arrives tomorrow, he announced. We have testimonies from 15 former employees, 3 business associates he cheated, and a witness who saw him arguing with your father the night he died. He looked at Grace seriously. Are you ready to face him? Grace nodded, feeling Nick's hand tighten around hers. I'm ready. The confrontation took place in the judge's chambers rather than open court, a strategic decision to prevent Hargrove from marshalling public support. When Hargrove entered, flanked by 2 attorneys, his face registered shock at the sight of Grace. You, he spat. You thieving little, Mr. Hargrove, Judge Carruthers interrupted sharply. You would do well to watch your language in my chambers. Hargrove composed himself, smoothing his expensive jacket. My apologies, Your Honor, but this woman stole valuable property from my home before fleeing. You mean these documents? The judge asked mildly, indicating the papers spread on his desk. The ones claiming ownership of a human being, a practice outlawed by the 13th Amendment to our Constitution, Hargrove's face reddened. That's not. You misunderstand. The girl's father owed me a debt. She agreed to work it off. Lies, Grace said quietly but firmly. My father owed you nothing. You forged those documents after he refused to sell me to you. Preposterous, Hargrove scoffed, looking to his lawyers for support. The girl is clearly delusional. Perhaps, the judge said, But these documents tell an interesting story, especially when examined by experts in handwriting and paper manufacture. He lifted one paper. This debt certificate is dated 1873, yet the paper was manufactured in 1875. Rather difficult to explain, wouldn't you say? Hargrove's confidence visibly faltered. A simple clerical error, my secretary, and what of Timothy Miller's death? The judge continued. A witness places you arguing with him hours before his body was found. I speak with many people, Hargrove blustered. I can hardly be held responsible for what happens to them afterward. The hearing continued for hours, evidence mounting against Hargrove. His lawyers grew increasingly uncomfortable as witness after witness testified to his corrupt business practices, forgeries, and intimidation. Finally, when the last witness had spoken, Judge Carruthers addressed Hargrove directly. Stanford Hargrove, I find sufficient evidence exists to charge you with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. You will be held without bail pending trial. Hargrove lunged to his feet, his face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. I'll have your position for this. Do you have any idea who my friends are? I'm well aware of your connections, Mr. Hargrove, the judge replied calmly, but even they cannot protect you from this evidence. He nodded to the bailiffs. Take him into custody. As Hargrove was led away, still shouting threats, Nick took the documents from the judge's desk and handed them to Grace. Your choice, he said softly. Grace studied the papers that had nearly condemned her to a life of servitude. Then, moving to the fireplace that heated the judge's chambers, she dropped them one by one into the flames. They never had any power over me, she said, watching them curl and blacken. Not really. Nick stepped beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. No, he agreed, they never did. 2 months later, after Hargrove's trial and conviction, Grace stood on the porch of Nick's ranch house, now their ranch house. The spring air was sweet with wildflowers, the pasture green with new growth. Nick's small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Strong arms encircled her from behind, and Nick's chin rested on her shoulder. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Nichols? Grace smiled, leaning back against her husband's chest. Their wedding 3 weeks ago had been small but joyful, with Martha, William, Judge Carruthers, and even old Joseph in attendance. I'm thinking about papers, she said. How some can enslave and others can free. Nick kissed her temple. Like our marriage certificate. Grace turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had risked everything to save a stranger who had become the love of her life in the process. That paper doesn't define us, she said softly. What's between us is more than words on a page. It always has been. Nick smiled, pulling her closer. Smart woman. Reminds me why I fell in love with you in the first place. As the sun set over their land truly theirs now, with the deed in both their names, Grace silently thanked whatever fate had led her to Nick's cabin that desperate night. From property to partner, from captive to beloved, her journey had been one of both fire and redemption. I love you, Yates Nichols, she whispered against his lips. And I love you, Grace Nichols, he replied, his voice tender with promise. Forever free, forever mine.